Palestinians helped set the stage for genocide. In December 2022, prisoner abuse began escalating when Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu appointed Itamar Ben-Gvir, who heads Otzma Yehudit, or the Jewish Power Party, as the Minister of National Security. Ben-Gvir used his control of the police and the Israel Prison Services, or IPS, to make it his ministerial duty to, quote, worsen the conditions of the terrorists in the prison and to reduce their rights to the minimum required by law. After October 7th, Israel's ground invasion of Gaza swept up thousands of Palestinians in indiscriminate capture operations, including humanitarian workers, women, children, disabled, and elderly people. Human Rights Watch reported that at least 310 healthcare workers and patients and their companions were taken into custody from Gaza hospitals and clinics when Israeli forces attacked these facilities. According to reports gathered by the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, men and boys detained by Israeli forces in Gaza, including UNRWA staff members, were used for military purposes as human shields by being forced to enter tunnels and buildings ahead of soldiers. A deluge of photos and videos of gross mistreatment of Palestinians in military custody, shot by soldiers themselves, has circulated on social media. This includes images of shirtless or naked Palestinians bound and blindfolded, and some being dragged across gravel and stomped and kicked in their heads and genitals. Images of soldiers humiliating and brutalizing Palestinians, which constitute material evidence of torture and CID, serve to amplify the unfettered violence in Gaza. In the context of Israel's genocidal campaign, prisons and detention facilities became battlefields, and state agents targeted and treated prisoners in ways that paralleled the besieging and indiscriminate war on the people of Gaza. Interrogators adopted the crudest forms of physical violence, including beatings, protracted shackling in painful positions, suffocation, and sexual assault. The IPS instituted measures to degrade Palestinians' already terrible conditions of confinement, including drastically altering their access, or reducing their access to food and water, which amounts to a starvation policy, and denying them access to medical care and treatment for diseases and injuries. Electricity was cut off and personal possessions, including medicine, were seized. Soldiers and guards rampaged through cell blocks, attacking prisoners and firing rubber bullets and tear gas. Some prisoners were put into solitary confinement, and many others were jammed into overcrowded cells. The abuse of Palestinians as such was evident in the fact that longtime prisoners and those taken into custody after October 7th were abused without distinction. At least 70 Palestinians have been killed under torture or died from medical neglect in custody since October 2023. In order to keep this custodial reign of terror hidden from public view, the IPS immediately barred visits by representatives from the International Committee of the Red Cross. All communication and visits by family members were prohibited. Lawyers' access to their clients was halted for months and still remains severely restricted. Most Gazans were detained under Israel's 2002 Incarceration of Unlawful Combatants Law, which copies America's 2001 presidential order on unlawful combatants. So Israel's law empowers the state to secretly detain anyone who is alleged to have directly or indirectly participated in hostile acts against the state of Israel. Under this law, civilians can be indefinitely detained if the military suspects they're unlawful combatants or if their release would harm state security. On December 18, 2023, the Knesset amended the unlawful combatants law to enable people to be held incommunicado for 45 days without an arrest warrant or any oversight by a court. Now Palestinians subject to this law can be denied access to a lawyer for up to 75 days on the order of a prison official, and the court can extend this order for 180 days. Everywhere incommunicado detention is used, it is always a cover for torture. Palestinians released from custody emerged emaciated, bruised, and deeply scarred from tight cuffing. Some have provided testimonies to Adamir and other human rights organizations. In May 2024, Euro-Mediterranean Human Rights Monitor interviewed approximately 100 Palestinians from Gaza, including 22 women, 4 children, and 17 elderly men, who testified about various forms of cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment and extrajudicial punishments, including strip searches and forced nudity, breaking bones and teeth, being stepped, spit, and urinated on, punishment for praying, and threats of rape and murder. The Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem issued a report in August with testimonies from 55 released Palestinians, concluding that Israeli prisons and detention center facilities, quote, in which every inmate is intentionally condemned to severe, relentless pain and suffering, operate as de facto torture camps. Investigations by other human rights organizations have drawn the same conclusion. The military established detention facilities on at least 3 bases, Sde Taimen in the Negev, Anatot, and Ofer in the West Bank, where thousands of mostly Gazans were held. These facilities were functionally black sites because the identities of those held there were kept secret, thus amounting to forced disappearance. As of April 2025, according to the Palestinian Center for Human Rights, hundreds of Palestinians who were forcibly disappeared are still missing. The first account of torture by a whistleblowing Israeli was an April 24th letter a doctor working in Sde Taimen sent to Israeli cabinet members, informing them that prisoners were having legs amputated due to handcuff injuries. He writes, quote, I am warning you that the facility's operations do not comply with a single section among those dealing with health in the incarceration of unlawful combatants law. In May, CNN published an expose about horrific forms of abuse at Sde Taimen based on accounts by 3 whistleblowing soldiers and 12 Gazans who were released. On July 29th, the Military Advocate General, or MAG, moved forward on an investigation of the gang rape of a Palestinian from Gaza by 9 soldiers at Sde Taimen. This singular gesture of accountability was motivated by the fact that the attack was captured on surveillance video. The victim was so badly brutalized in the course of being sodomized that he suffered a ruptured bowel, severe damage to his anus, broken ribs, and lung damage. When military police were dispatched to the base to arrest the gang rape suspects, they were attacked by other soldiers. A mob of Israelis, including members of the Knesset, flocked to Sde Taimen in support of the alleged rapists. The investigation incited pro-rape political blowback. Ben Gvir and numerous politicians condemned the MAG, praised the accused soldiers as heroes, and asserted that, quote, everything is legitimate in the treatment of Palestinians. The charges of genocide that have been leveled against Israel, including by this tribunal on Thursday, and South Africa's petition in the International Court of Justice, and the application for warrants by the chief prosecutor of the International Court for Netanyahu and now former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant for war crimes, have emphasized mass killing and indiscriminate bombing, the total destruction of institutions, and the intentional starvation of Palestinians. But for this tribunal, we emphasize that accountability for torture is essential and integral to the demand for accountability for genocide. As the Palestinian Center for Human Rights argues in its new report titled Torture and Genocide, torture is not only a human rights violation or a war crime, but also an integral component of Israel's genocide against Palestinians, because the systematic use of torture is not merely a method of inflicting pain and suffering on individuals, but a deliberate tool designed to destroy the Palestinian people.
Thank you very much, Lisa, for that stirring presentation. Our next speaker on this topic of patterns of genocide is Farah Ahmad. She is a lawyer and member of the Arab Group for the Protection of Nature, working on Palestinian and regional food sovereignty. Farah, please welcome her.
It's been over 11 weeks since any meaningful supplies have been allowed to enter Gaza, exacerbating the already dire situation after more than a year and a half of wanton attacks and severe restrictions on the movement of people and goods. We can't bear witness to the present moment without seeing it as an expansion of the blockade that has isolated Gaza from the world for more than 15 years. The Israeli occupation has used food as a weapon since the start of its genocidal colonial project in Palestine, and nowhere is this more evident than in Gaza today. Among the countless other violations laid out by my colleagues, Israel, aided and abetted by its allies, has violated the right to food and the prohibition of starvation. These rights are codified in customary international law, which we'll lay out briefly today. The right to food is enshrined in international human rights law and is unique in that it's the only right in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights that creates extraterritorial obligations for states, requiring them to internationally cooperate to achieve this right. The UN committee related to the covenant elaborates that state parties have a joint and individual responsibility to cooperate in providing disaster relief and humanitarian assistance, and also advises states from refraining from food embargoes or similar scenarios that impact food production and access to food in other countries. Moreover, under customary international law, a state's duty extends to areas where it exercises effective control, whether or not such control is exercised in accordance with international law. The Geneva Conventions, for example, place obligations on occupying powers to ensure food for occupied populations to the fullest extent of the means available to it, including bringing in the foodstuffs if the resources of the occupied territory are inadequate. In this context, the Israeli occupation is responsible for providing food in Gaza and ensuring that all necessary supplies are available, regardless of whether Israel claims that it does not occupy Gaza itself. In fact, the ICJ recently reaffirmed this in its 2024 advisory opinion, as Professor Sultani established in his presentation earlier today. The prohibition of starvation of civilians is codified in international humanitarian law, international criminal law, and is reaffirmed in a unanimous UN Security Council resolution. When it comes to starvation, international law doesn't just consider the deprivation of food, it also includes objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population. While there is no definitive list of what qualifies as an indispensable object, it includes agricultural inputs, food, water, healthcare, shelter, sanitation, and care for the young. These objects, indispensable to the survival of the civilian population, have heightened protections compared to regular civilian objects under international humanitarian law, as there aren't any carve-outs, such as the principle of proportionality, which Professor Jamshidi will elaborate on later today. In fact, regardless of whether these objects are also used by combatants or whether they provide significant military utility, warring parties are prohibited from attacking, destroying, or depriving civilians of these objects. Moreover, they can't be targeted for their substance value unless they provide sustenance exclusively to combatants. They can only be targeted for reasons other than their sustenance value only if they're used for direct support for military action, and only if they're not expected to leave the civilians starving or forced to move. Finally, allegations of diversions by belligerents are not enough to deprive the civilian population of these indispensable objects. The devastation in Gaza has been endless. We don't have time to go through the full list of the deprivation of these objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population, or how they've been attacked and targeted, but I'll highlight a few areas, supplementing my colleagues' presentations. In terms of food production, Gaza's entire food system has been broken down. The Israeli military has attacked farmland, destroying over 80% of trees and 70% of crops. Of the farmlands that have not been totally destroyed, many are inaccessible by threat of fire and expanding buffer zones. Moreover, there are toxins and contamination from exploded and unexploded ordnances on the land and in the water, which will impact Gaza's food security and health for years to come. Additionally, the destruction of critical agricultural infrastructure and farming assets, including greenhouses, wells, bakeries, and warehouses, contribute to the widespread starvation conditions. The killing, detention, and displacement of food production workers has compounded the inability of Gazans to support themselves food-wise as well as financially. Even livestock hasn't been spared, as there is evidence of multiple attacks on animals, and many have died due to shortage of feed and supplies. When it comes to water, due to Israeli attacks on wells and drinking water installations, people in Gaza have access to less than 5 liters of water per day for all uses, including drinking, cooking, and washing. This is well below the amounts considered necessary for survival and less than the amount of water needed for a single toilet flush. Moreover, most of the water is unfit for human consumption in the first place. In terms of sanitation and hygiene, all wastewater plants and over 70% of the sewage pumps in Gaza have been destroyed by Israeli attacks, leading to disastrous public health and sanitation consequences, including the flow of raw sewage, which has been leaking back into the soil as well as water sources. In addition to the impact on food production, the lack of water to clean or wash is deadly. Due to the lack of access to proper hygiene, infectious diseases have spread, and deaths from disease are expected to dwarf the number of those killed by bombs or gunfire, which will continue even after a permanent ceasefire is achieved. Not only has Israel failed to fulfill its obligations to ensure that there are adequate food and medical supplies in Gaza, which must be done at all means at its disposal, it continues to impede international aid from entering Gaza, has killed and detained humanitarian workers, the most famous being the attacks on the World Food Kitchen, killing 7 workers in 3 different targeted attacks in a single day. Moreover, Israel has targeted civilians at food distribution sites, further compounding starvation factors and leading to chaos and fear. In one instance, known as the First Flower Massacre, over 112 Palestinians were killed and 760 injured at an attempted food distribution site in Gaza City in early 2024. Moreover, Israel's restrictions on what's allowed to enter means that objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population have been denied entry long before October 7, 2023. From seeds and critical agricultural inputs to prevent Palestinians from being able to feed themselves, to oxygen tanks such that Palestinians literally cannot breathe. For example, this past winter, nearly 1 million Gazans did not have adequate shelter due to restrictions on the delivery of essential winter gear, such as waterproof tents and blankets, and by January 2025, at least 74 children died to the brutal weather conditions. The consequences of this destruction are clear and vast. Virtually all of Gaza's population has been and continues to be in an acute food crisis, phase 3 out of 5 in the IPC classification, or worse. And at least one point, over 30% of the population was in a famine or humanitarian catastrophe, phase 5. More than 57 people have died directly due to starvation, and there are over 70,000 cases of acute malnutrition, which have long-term health consequences for the victims, including impaired growth and development, increased risk of chronic diseases, and reduced cognitive function. And these effects will impact future generations through epigenetics. When it comes to sieges, while sieges are not necessarily unlawful according to international law, a siege is only lawful when directed exclusively against an enemy's armed forces. It's arguably impossible to conduct a lawful siege in urban areas such as Gaza. In fact, for example, the perpetrators of the siege of our host city, Sarajevo, were convicted by the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia of, among other things, inflicting terror on the civilian population in violation of Articles 51 of Additional Protocol 1 and Article 13 of Additional Protocol 2 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. Issuing warnings or evacuation orders does not absolve warring parties from their obligations to civilians in a siege. Even if the civilian population does not leave a besieged area, they must still be protected under international humanitarian law as long as they don't actively engage in the hostilities. Israel's argument that any person remaining in a besieged area after warning becomes a legitimate target as a combatant, as they did during the siege in North Gaza, has no standing international law and must be flat out rejected. Finally, when we talk about liability under international criminal law, the intentional starvation of civilians is listed as a war crime in the Rome Statute. The extent of starvation and the consequences, including death or disability, would elevate the starvation to crimes against humanity and the crime of genocide. One generally has to have intent and knowledge to be found liable under international criminal law. Intent can be either established when a person means to engage in the conduct, or alternatively, if a person means to cause a consequence or is aware that such consequence will occur in the ordinary course of events. South Africa documented over 10 pages of expression of genocidal intent by Israeli officials and others in its pleading to the ICJ. Many of these statements directly reference the starvation of civilians. More recently, after breaking the ceasefire, Netanyahu announced that all supplies would be prevented from entering Gaza until Hamas agreed to his demands, which is a clear indication of the intent to use food as a weapon and starve the entire population of Gaza. In terms of conduct, starvation is an obvious consequence of the wanton destruction and deprivation of objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population of Gaza, which has been warned by countless international experts, countries, as well as the ICJ in its provisional measures. In conclusion, while we live in an age full of contemporaneous evidence being gathered and broadcast, the world fails to move to take action against Israel's acceleration of its genocidal campaign. The violations of international law are not just borne by Israel, but by the conduct of its allies and the silence of many other countries. Instead of instituting sanctions globally against Israel, and despite multiple ICJ rulings, mass protests, and warnings from international organizations, weapon imports to Israel actually increased after October 7, 2023. Moreover, despite multiple warnings to prevent starvation by allowing humanitarian aid into Gaza, Israel in fact strangulated the entry of aid even more. Egypt is also directly complicit in the starvation of civilians by not opening the Rafah border. This echoes back to the starvation situation instituted during the Nakba of 1948, which led to the establishment of UNRWA as a relief to the Palestinian civilian population. The attempt by Israel and its allies to dismantle this agency must be stopped. Moreover, we must continue to put pressure on the international community to stop the attempts to starve, kill, displace, and erase Palestinians since at least 1948, bring the perpetrators to justice, demand the right of return, as well as compensation and reparations. Thank you.
How's that? Thank you. You give a very efficient and disturbing overview of the policies and practices of torture by Israeli soldiers and police against Palestinians. We commonly think of torture as an aggressive form of violence against the target population. Well, it can also be seen as a means to control and subjugate the population if it is widespread enough and practiced often enough. And I think we saw that in another example, which is the anti-colonial movement against French control of Algeria in the 1950s. What are the patterns of control and domination over the Palestinians that you think are inherent in the Israeli use of torture?
Thank you. Well, let me say, before I come directly to that, there's something, as a scholar of torture, I can give you a little tidbit on what I have come to learn. You can never really understand torture by looking at victims. You have to look at perpetrators. Why are perpetrators actually engaged? What are the purposes that torture serves? Who is deemed torturable? And so there's four purposes of torture. One of them, which is very common in the Israeli context, is what we call judicial torture, when people are tortured for statements that can then be used in a legal proceeding. And in the case of Israel, the legal proceedings in their Israeli military courts in order to imprison Palestinians. So that was a major So Israel relied very much on judicial torture as its way. Another form of torture, the kind maybe that I was describing in the post-October 7th period, but certainly not new to that, would be called penal torture or extrajudicial punishments of a bodily sort. So when guards are beating up people, when they're already in custody, that would be, without any kind of legal process, that would be penal torture. A third kind of torture is called interrogational torture. That's what the United States has used, and also Israel in the case of trying to find out so-called actionable intelligence in the context of armed conflict. So people are captured and tortured in order to find out where other people that they are the enemy are. And so that was certainly an element of the post-October 7th, was like finding out, not only punishing Palestinians, through the torturous methods, but also trying to elicit information about Hamas or where are the hostages. And then the last kind of torture, which I think the sort of the self-unconscious publication of all these kind of pictures that soldiers took of themselves abusing Palestinians, is called terroristic torture, when you torture some to terrorize the many. And so that is another phenomenon that was very common in dictatorships, where when people would be disappeared, you knew that they were gone and they'd been tortured, but nobody could see it, but it terrorizes the rest of society to keep them in line. So I think that all four of the purposes of torture are prevailing in the Israeli context, but the most common ones are interrogational torture and judicial torture in order to know the enemy and imprison the enemy.
Thank you very much for that, Lisa. Farah, you, in your presentation on food, quite rightly mentioned the very strict legal prohibition against the use of food as a tool of war or conflict. I'd like to put a question to you that tries to widen the aperture of that picture, to think about using food as a brutal form of control over the population. What does the use of starvation and food obstruction, particularly with respect to Gaza, but not only with respect to the last 19 months, but the control of food that went into Gaza even before 2023. What does that use of starvation and food obstruction mean as a means of trying to achieve a longer-term political goals over the Palestinians?
Thanks, Michael, for that question. And I mean, similar to what Lisa was saying in the context of physical torture, you could see the deprivation of food and other necessary supplies as a societal form of torture. And it can be used for multiple reasons, including the ability to direct the population to submit to your will, to be too tired to be able to resist, and to also drop the ceiling of what's possible in terms of life. So it is a form of torture. It does rise to the realm of genocide when you consider the scope and the length of this type of deprivation.
Okay, thank you very much for that. What we're going to do now is have 4 testimonies by Palestinians read to you. And Farah, you're going to go first with that. Please come over here.
I'm going to read an excerpt of a testimony from Diala Abdo from Damir. She starts, and this is a translated testimony. I was arrested on January 17, 2024 at the container checkpoint while returning from Hebron Khalil to Ramallah at around 2 p.m. I was in a public car, and as soon as they saw our car, they rubbed the chauffeur on the side. Then they checked the IDs of everyone in the car and returned them to us. Then they asked about me and tried to take me down. They were border guards, and I knew that from the lawyers later when I described the dress code The checkpoint official came and took me from behind the container checkpoint. Then she twisted my two hands back and pushed my back with her hands, and this process was repeated more than once. Then she filmed me on her cell phone, put me back in the car, then dropped me off again, and took my phone, and then said to the chauffeur, "Come out, we're gonna take her." She took me behind the checkpoint where a border police soldier came and started telling me that you're Hamas and that you meet all the Hamas conditions, that your youthful color was a joke. I was working on you, and very bad insults about my parents. I wasn't handcuffed until this moment, after about an hour, during which they tied me with plastic straps to the front. Then they took me to a car, and an officer asked me if I knew why I was being taken, and I told him no. He answered and said, "You'll find out later in the indictment," and added, by the way, "Say hello to your comrades in the PFLP," and asked me if I knew Khalid Jarrar. The longest camp I stayed in was for 6 hours in an open space like a barracks. It was very cold. I didn't know the name of the camps or which area they were, and when I asked questions, they would yell at me and tell me that you're forbidden to ask and forbidden to know anything. I would ask for a bathroom, and they refused all the time, and of course, with the extreme cold and the iron floor I was sitting on, I felt that I needed to go to the bathroom all the time. At first, I was sitting normally. A little later, they came and unfastened the cleats and tied my hands behind me with plastic cleats as well, and forced me to sit on my knees and not to move. I was sitting on my knees for almost 6 hours. The soldiers were beating my knees with their mats on the iron of the barracks behind me, and I was scared. I kept needing the bathroom, and whenever I asked, the soldiers would tell me to shut up, and I could hear my cell phone ringing continuously while it was with the soldiers. They brought it for me and asked for the password, and I gave it to them. Then the soldier lifted the blindfold from my eyes, grabbed my finger, and put on the cell phone's fingerprint, and when I looked towards them, he pushed me and yelled at me and told me not to look at them. And when I looked towards him, he pushed me and told me not to look. After about 6 hours, the soldiers came and lifted me from the ground. Of course, there were no female soldiers among them. All of them were men. They put me in a car where I was tied in the back, and I couldn't enter because I was tied. So the soldiers had to lift me under my arms with their hands, and it was very violent. And when the car drove a bit, they opened the car and threw an abused youth on top of me. I asked him his name, and he told me his name was Muhammad. I asked him where we were, and he told me that we're near Beit Lahem. After a while, they opened the car again and got the young man Muhammad out and beat him severely. And I could hear the sound of the beating. Then they immediately walked into the car, and they stopped beating him and opened the door. I was afraid it was going to be my turn to be beaten after Muhammad, but the army doctor came. Apparently, she unbuckled me, removed me the blindfold, and asked me about my health condition, and I told her I would not answer until you took me to the bathroom. And after she made some calls, she told me she would take my blood pressure. I told her I have a special health condition and suffer from epilepsy, and I have to take my medication. And when they knew I suffer from epilepsy, I think that's why they tied me forward and not backward and took me to the bathroom. After that, they transferred me to the HajjarRight crossing, and this after a long-hour journey in the camps, where I reached HajjarRight at about 3 o'clock in the morning. In HajjarRight, the treatment was better than the camps. The search was semi-naked and not naked. Then they took me to the clinic, and the male jailer who took me to the clinic, I told him that I have epilepsy. When I got to the clinic, the nurse was asleep, and they made me feel guilty that they woke the nurse up. The jailer took me to a cell with an open window, which was very cold. They gave me a very, very dirty mattress and blanket. The cell was very dirty. The bathroom is inside the cells on one side. There's no door, obviously, and of course, anyone who passes can see the bathroom because the cell is not locked. I couldn't use the bathroom until hours later, and they handed us to another unit after 5 hours and transferred us to Damon prison by prison cars. So at this point, it's around 2 p.m. The next day, and there I stayed for 12 months. They gave me an administrative order a few days later for 4 months, which was renewed twice after that. They didn't give me clothes from the prisons or pajamas. They were clothes available from former female prisoners that I used. The food was less and less all the time, according to the ministerial decision to deprive us of food. When I entered the prison, there were 105 female prisoners, including a large group of prisoners from Gaza. When they released the prisoners from Gaza, the prisoner who had one blanket now had more than one, but after that, the number of female prisoners increased. So clothes and blankets became fewer for the female prisoners, especially at the beginning of the winter season from the end of 2024. And the conditions became worse for us in the cold, especially with the new administration in Damon prison. Once the new administration came, they stormed the section and ordered each prisoner to take 2 blankets and leave everything else in the room. When we came back, they had searched the rooms and everything was confiscated. Even our Qur'ans were taken away, the plates and spoons they kept, and then they only left us with 1 spoon per room, which we all took turns to eat. They even confiscated our sports shoes and our slippers. So some of the female prisoners started going out in the courtyard barefoot without any shoes. And they confiscated anything we used as a container. During my detention, I was isolated 5 times. I started my journey with isolation at first because of an issue with the deputy director of the prison at the beginning of my arrest, where I stayed for 3 days. And then the second isolation happened a few days later because the guards wanted to search me inside a bathroom and I refused, where they isolated me for 4 days. The third isolation was for 5 days because I defended some of the female prisoners when they were taken to isolation. And the fourth isolation was on October 7th, 2024. A large number of guards broke in. They tied us up. They brought me to the warden, let her search me, and there I saw a police dog, intelligence officers, and guards. Our room was full of soldiers as well as in the yard. They put a blindfold on me and put me on my knees in the yard. Then they brought the female prisoners, and of course the dog was passing. And they carried me by my hands and took me into an isolation cell in Section 7. There they unzipped me and I recognized them. Of course, it was a little cold and I was wearing light clothes. I told the officer I needed clothes. The officer told me, you need 10 minutes and then you'll have to come back. And then this isolation lasted for 34 days. Thank you.
We'll next invite Nimar Sultani to make one of the presentations from the witnesses.
So I'm going to read the excerpts from testimony of a journalist who was arrested in Al-Shifa Hospital, and then I'll read an excerpt till the moment he reaches State Iman, which we heard about from Professor Hajjar, and the start of his ordeal. So it's a long testimony. I'm going to just read excerpts. His name is Mahmoud Ziyad Muhammad Alewa. I work as a journalist. I was arrested on the 18th of March, 2024 from Al-Shifa Hospital, where I was at work. The beginning of the arrest, where we were present in the hospital, and it was normal, and the hospital contains displaced people, doctors, journalists, nursing staff, and administrators. Suddenly, at around 2 a.m., bullets were fired intensely. I was asleep. I immediately went out of my room, where I and my fellow journalists were. I went in front of the specialized surgery building. There were a quadcopter drones shooting at people around the hospital. Anyone who moved around the hospital was shot. It was a very difficult scene. I was standing at the door and monitoring the situation as a journalist. At this moment, shots were fired at us, and we immediately withdrew from the building. I headed to the back door to try to get out of the hospital, but it was very difficult. When I withdrew from the front door to the back door, I was surprised when I opened the back door of the building. A tank robot next to a building called the Burns building, which is a Burns building inside the hospital, fired a shell at the building in which, where I was, which is a specialized surgery building. I went directly to the first floor to take shelter from the shells and found that the shell was directed towards the first floor, specifically in a room where there were displaced people. I went to this room and found everyone in it martyred. The shooting was for about 45 minutes and did not stop for a second on buildings and people, accompanied by voices through loudspeakers, on drones and vehicles, asking all people not to go out, and that whoever goes out puts himself in danger. This was a media show, and they were filming these moments on the basis that they were protecting people, but on the contrary, buildings were targeted with bullets and shells, and anyone who moved after 3 a.m. on the same day. I was from the first row that came out of the specialized surgery building, which is the largest building inside the hospital. When I came out, we stood out at the so-called Halabak cameras, and they sorted out people. Either they tell them to go out to the south, or they tell them to stay. Of course, they didn't have any transparency or criteria for choosing those they took for investigation, because they chose old people, minors, journalists, doctors. I stayed waiting for my turn in the investigation, during which an officer came and stood next to me. He spoke fluent Arabic and is basically an Arab. He asked me, "What are you worth? And what do you say? Why do you say you are a displaced person?" I told him, "No, I'm not a displaced person." He was holding the cell phone, and I could see the cell phone screen with my picture, i.e. my Palestinian ID picture. And other than my picture, there is nothing, just a white screen, knowing that what they want is next to the name of the details. I told him I was a journalist, and he was looking at his phone. At that moment, he looked at me with a strange look and asked me, "Who do you work with?" And I told him I worked over the years on the contract system with channels like BBC and Al Jazeera, but I had terminated my contracts with them before the war. I was in regular clothes as I came out of the building without a press uniform. But my equipment was next to me in a bag, and he told me to leave it, and then ordered me to take off my clothes, and I took off my clothes. And they gave me a white overalls that I wore. Then he cuffed my hands behind my back and took me to a room, sat me on a chair, and blindfolded me, and he was provoked and pulled it a lot on my eyes. Then he went out of the room and closed the door strongly, and then he came out of the room and closed the door. 2 minutes later, he came in. I recognized his voice, with more than one person who was cursing me and cursing God. They attacked me directly. They beat me very violently and severely. I couldn't see, but I estimated that there were at least 3 soldiers, and the beating was on my head, my eyes, directly, and the area of the rib cage, what is called feathers, and on my legs, Even now, I suffer from pain in my left knee because of the beating, knowing that they did not ask me any questions, and I heard them speak in Arabic and told this in a little more. The beating lasted about a third of an hour without stopping to the point that I reached a stage where I did not know where the beating was coming from on my body. Then one of them dragged me in an inhumane manner from the room to a room where there were about 50 young men, including youths, minors, old people, and threw me on top of them. Of course, I was handcuffed behind my back and couldn't balance well. At this moment, I lost my balance and fell on top of some of them. We stayed almost until 2 a.m., 24 hours after the event itself. They began to take the young men, one by one, to a truck, threw us all together inside the truck, then drowned all of us with cold water, knowing that it was winter and cold. And they drowned everyone in this truck in cold water. And we reached a stage of cold that no one can imagine, so that some of us fainted from the intensity of the cold. Because they were sick and injured, and we had patients with platinum in their body, and some young men were bleeding. They did not care and didn't move the soldiers, and even the officers present. We were transferred to an area where I don't know, but most of those present told us that we were in the Nahal Oz waiting area. We sat down, and they didn't deal with us except in the most horrible ways, insults, beatings from all of them. We waited a period of time and then left us to another place. And before we got out of the place, they took before we left some prisoners. Then we heard the sound of gunfire. I don't know if they were executed. One of the young men, whose name I don't know, who was detained with us on the same day, confirmed this. He said he saw 4 people executed before his own eyes in the Nahal Oz area. And even when we came out of the building to sort us out in the Shifa hospital, on our way to the cameras, I saw people on the ground with their hands tied behind their back and executed, field executions. We were deported from Nahal Oz in regular passenger buses, and everyone inside these buses were Arabic-speaking soldiers who insulted us and beat us, even the sick and the elderly. We almost reached the Gaza envelope area, which is what is called Sdei Timan, at about 7 in the morning, by my estimate. And of course, they received us from the teams and handed us over to other teams with beatings. They did not stop the beatings until we entered the section and what we call the barracks. I lived the first few days in Barracks A, which consists of A1 and A2. When we arrived, we had to sleep, and we had not slept since the moment of arrest. And we arrived in the early morning hours. There was a police officer present who told us that we would not sleep because bedtime starts at 12 o'clock at night. They gave us a set of orders from the beginning of the arrest, including a certain session, such as stretching our legs and staying seated straight. Our eyes are not allowed to look up. We are not allowed to look left or right. And we are not allowed to talk to the person next to us. We were handcuffed with iron handcuffs. They refused even to allow us to wash or to go to the bathroom. The bathroom was also by appointment, and there was a system of 4 times a day. And the shawish taught us how to pronounce the arrest number in Hebrew. And the bathroom was with permission of the shawish. It is forbidden to stay more than a minute, and the officer present asked the shawish to let us know if the prisoner stays more than 1 minute. Even the bathrooms themselves were not humane and fit for human use. They were plastic. And as for sleeping, we slept on mattresses no thicker than 1 centimeter, without pillows. Most of us used plastic slippers as a pillow under the head. We arrived at 12 o'clock, and in the middle of the night, on the first day of detention, the shawish said, "Prepare yourselves for sleep," as it was time to wake up with permission and time to sleep with permission. The officer told us in Hebrew, "With you for 10 to sleep," and the shawish was translating for us. And as soon as we put our head to sleep, I didn't feel that I had fallen asleep, until we heard the sound of firing bombs and the sound of wild dogs. And at the same time, one of the officers of the repression squad called one of the officers of the repression squad and told everyone to lie down on the ground, meaning on the belly, and the hands raised up. And then the repression squad entered. The first time they entered and their officers spoke the phrase, "Welcome to hell."
So this is a testimony from a child prisoner, ImadPre-recorded. I was arrested on January 25, 2024 from Khan Yunis in the Mawasi area at approximately 9 a.m. 5 days after the siege of Al-Mawasi area, residents were asked by the army to leave through safe passages. And while I was leaving through the safe passages, I was asked by the soldiers at the checkpoint. They asked me to throw my belongings into a hole in the ground, and then I was taken to a playground near the checkpoint that was turned into a place of detention. After which I was stripped completely naked except for my boxers, tied with plastic cleats, blindfolded, and thrown on the ground. During that time, I and the other prisoners were severely beaten by the soldiers present in the area. While I was lying on the ground, I was personally assaulted by 2 soldiers with feet, hands, and gun butts, which caused me to feel a fracture in one of my ribs in the chest. At night, at about 10 o'clock, we were taken on foot to Al-Khair Hospital in the same area, where we were admitted and where we were greeted by an army officer carrying an iron stick with which he beat everyone who passed in front of him on the head. And I was hit with the stick. We were kept for 2 hours in the hospital, and then we were transferred by a large truck to an unknown place where there is an army in the same area of Khan Yunis. We were kept in this place all night, tied up and blindfolded in a semi-naked state, and in the rain, kneeling on the stones. Then at dawn, we were transported again in a military cargo to Israel to detention centers that contained barracks, whose name I did not know at first, but later I learned that it was State Teman, where I stayed there for 15 days. Where during our time in the camp, we were all placed in the same place. Children and elderly people in the same place. I spent the 15 days in the barracks with my hands tied to the front with iron clamps and blindfolded all the time for 24 hours, even while eating, bathing, and using the bathroom. I suffered severe wounds and pain from the restraints. As for bathing, it was 2 days a week, every Monday and Thursday, but unfortunately, my name was at the bottom of the list, which led me to the roll that came to me once for bathing, as my name was removed from the roll for the end of the bathing period. As for clothes, we were given external clothes only once when we arrived at the barracks in what is called clothes of the cross, a residential suit. But otherwise, we only took underwear during the shower. As for eating, the food situation was very bad and difficult, as we were given 2 pieces of toast with a small box of cheese, and sometimes we were given some fruits, such as an apple or tomato, unwashed. Sometimes these vegetables were rotten, and we were forced to eat them. We used water from the showers inside the barracks, and during the detention, they used to enter a squad of the army once a week to prevent the prisoners, especially the old people, from sleeping as a kind of punishment. Where the time to sleep was approximately at 12 midnight, and during the entry of the squad, a bomb was thrown between us. We were ordered to sleep on the stomach. And then the soldiers and dogs began walking over the prisoners and randomly beating those present. They were a complete unit consisting of approximately 30 soldiers with full equipment such as sticks and armor. Sometimes half of them entered, and I personally was beaten while I still suffer today from pain in my leg because they used sticks, batons, and hands in beatings where these soldiers were huge, and we were blinded and did not see them. I was beaten for the first time in the detention center on Saturday, 2 days after my arrest, at night during their raid. This time I was beaten and my right leg was hurt because of the sticks. And the soldiers stay for half an hour during the raid, and then an officer with the rank of captain named Captain Jafar enters and insults and yells at the detainees, calling them pigs and threatening them that no one knows where they are. If we kill you, no one will know. And that every prisoner has the right to one bullet. During my stay in detention, I witnessed 3 repressions by army units in the same way. During my detention, I was brought before the court twice, and I was interrogated by the army once in the Baraksat and was subjected to electric shocks. The interrogation was approximately 3 days after my arrest in the so-called Baraksat, and with music, where I sat in the interrogation for 3 days. I was transported in a military vehicle in the same area of the camp to the nearby interrogation barracks, and my clothes were removed, and I was dressed in a white robe and handcuffed forward blindfolded, and placed in a room with headphones in which loud music was played all the time without stopping as a psychological torture, which caused me a complex and psychological harm. While I was in the disco room, I was given 1 meal. On the first day, I was given 1 loaf with a slice of pepper, and the second day, I was given 3 loaves with a box of cheese, 15 grams. I was sometimes taken to the interrogation room. The first time I was taken to the interrogation room, an interrogator entered while I was tied to a chair. He beat me everywhere on my body. He beat me with his hands and feet randomly for 5 to 10 minutes and threatened me to confess and speak without denial. And then my eyes were blindfolded. The interrogator had blue eyes, blonde hair, and he was in a large physique and was about 30 years old. He interrogated me for 2 hours. During the interrogation, he asked me to tell him information about the whereabouts of terrorists, prisoners, missiles, tunnels, and asked me what I did on October 7. He asked me to confess to charges that I did not commit, such as my participation on October 7. I told him that I did not know anything of what was directed at me, and after 2 hours, I was returned to the music room. And during this period, I tried to sleep, but I slept and awoke continuously because of the music. And then on the second day, I was transferred to a second investigator who was better than the first and spoke to me calmly. He brought me a cup of tea and a piece of cake during the interrogation and treated me in a better way, telling me that you are still a child, you have a future ahead of you. He asked me to tell him about the locations of saboteurs and prisoners, but I replied that I did not know, and I was not beaten during this interrogation, but I was also tied to a chair. And then I was returned for a whole day to the disco room. But this time I remained tied and blindfolded and was not allowed to stand or move. Sometimes soldiers would come in and beat us or mock us, such as stopping one of the prisoners and ordering him to dance. And I personally had a soldier come in and hit me in the face. The number of the prisoners in the disco room changed. As the first day, the number was 10, and then it increased to 15. The number was always changing.
I'm going to give a testimony from one of our APN's focal points in Gaza. There's an ongoing project to revitalize the farmland, even in the midst of the genocidal attacks. And before I begin the testimony, I want to acknowledge that it was extremely difficult to obtain. The situation is beyond dire and communication is often impossible. It's not just the bombing, as well as the starvation. It's very hard to even find ways to charge your phone or move from place to place. The testimony has been translated and edited for brevity, and the witness's name will be withheld for their safety. There's no way to describe how bad things are here. The truth is worse than anything I can say, but I'll try because the world needs to hear us. There are no basic necessities of life left. People speak of minimum caloric intake, but there's no food at all to begin with. You can't reach a minimum when you start with nothing. Entire agricultural lands have been bulldozed, flattened, and erased. What was once green and growing is now gray, broken, and dead. What little food exists is sold at prices no one can afford. A single onion now costs $11. A kilogram of sugar is $37. But even if you had the money, you wouldn't find food. There is no flour. What we managed to pull out from under the rubble is mixed with sand, gravel, and remnants of explosives. There's no meat, no chicken, no fish. Gaza's only port has been destroyed. Our fishing boats have been shattered. There are no seeds, no fertilizers, no pesticides, no tools, no support. The agricultural companies that once helped farmers survive simply do not exist anymore. Our food systems have been systematically dismantled. And now people are falling in the streets from hunger, literally falling. We're witnessing starvation, not as a result of a natural disaster, not by accident, but by design. This is not just a humanitarian crisis. This is a war on life itself, on our land, our food, our people. Thank you.
Our last testimony.
I was arrested on March 23rd, 2024, from the vicinity of Al-Shifa Hospital, on the 5th day of the invasion of Al-Shifa Hospital. I was in a residential building displaced with my family, trapped since the first day of the invasion of Shifa, and we could hear the sound of a very large gunfire in addition to the sound of loudspeakers by the army. We did not understand what they were saying because they were talking and at the same time shooting. We tried to get out to escape the danger. I was with my family and 3 children and the neighbors in the building, and all of our attempts were unsuccessful. Our attempts were unsuccessful due to the fire, bombs, and shelling outside, in addition to the fact that we were shot at in our apartment on the 5th floor. We took shelter in a place not overlooking the windows, and we tried to go down to the entrance of the building to get out, but unfortunately, there was a pursuit of people trying to escape. There were field executions, and some of the people were followed by police dogs. So the situation was difficult. We stayed in the state hoping that they would withdraw, but on the 23rd of March 2024 at approximately 10 a.m., the army arrived at the building where I live and started breaking into the houses and going floor by floor, and I was on the 5th floor. The army sent one of the neighbor's son on the 3rd floor, and he was naked, only in his underwear. He told us men to strip naked and go down together and raise our hands. We went down. They put us in one apartment while the rest of the women and children were deported to the south. From that moment, they separated me from my wife and children. We were in the apartment about 15 to 20 people. The prisoners were interrogated and asked about themselves and their children. They took us to a building opposite Shifa Hospital, where there is a field investigation station. They interrogated me for about an hour. They asked me why I was in this area, asked me about wanted people and their whereabouts. I told them, I don't know. I'm interested in my job, and I am an independent man. They told me, we know you, but we want to take you to our place for a while, and they will ask you a few questions. I understood that they meant a military barracks inside Gaza, and that they would release me. But from that moment on, I waited for about 12 hours while I was tied up in the same place, and not a single soldier beat me during that time. At approximately 10 p.m., a group of young men and I were taken to a transportation vehicle. They loaded me into a cargo van. The vehicle passed us from Al-Bahr Street towards the east, and then I felt that we had walked the distance. And here I began to worry. We arrived at a military point, and the transportation group that was with us handed us over to a second squad. And this squad transferred us from the van to a passenger bus, and here the treatment changed completely. When we first entered the bus, one of the soldiers kicked me with his leg to my rib cage, and I held my breath for about a minute. Because of it, I held my breath. I broke 2 feathers, according to my estimate, and this without any preliminaries. 2 ribs, by the way. This is in Arabic. And this, without any preliminaries, suddenly became the blow. Then the bus walked us, and the whole way we were under beatings, leg kicks, batons, and even electric shocks for some, and insults, until we arrived at the prison, and I arrived very tired at Sadeh Timan. This was the most difficult night for me. First, when we arrived, they dressed me in pants and a blouse from them, and then I entered the small clinic, and they asked me medical questions. Then they took me to the wards. The time was around midnight. They tied us with an iron to the front and kept the blinders on. I passed days after days in the same prison until the 17th day. They called me for interrogation in Sadeh Timan. They took me to the disco room. I continued to be interrogated in the disco room for 48 hours, during which time I was called to the interrogation room. Back and forth. They interrogated me about 5 times in 48 hours, each time between 2 to 3 hours, and they kept me in the disco room for the rest of the time. The beginning of the interrogation was a friendly session. They asked about me, my family, my work, and then asked me about a person named Muhammad Abu Dalal. I told him I didn't know him, and when I said I didn't know him, his treatment of me changed, and he ordered the soldier behind me to beat me as I was sitting in a chair with my hands and feet tied. The beatings were on the head and ear scratching, and after he finished interrogating me, he suddenly hit me on the head and then took me back to the disco room. The treatment in the disco room is animal-like and not human, whether in the way of waking up from sleep and the way they handle drinking and eating. They throw food and water at us. I was woken up by kicking the legs on the waist, and originally we did not sleep but stretched out from exhaustion and fatigue, especially since the music is turned on 24 hours. Music is very loud, an MP fire speaker for wedding halls in a small room. This room is zinco walls and wooden floor with no windows. We stay in it blindfolded and tied with our hands tied and feet fitted with ironclads like a prison. But more than the sections, we are tied to the legs, and we sleep on a wooden floor with a rug on it. They summoned me again with a second interrogator, who asked me whether I knew tunnels, and I told it and told me that you're an architect, you must have passed through tunnels. And my answers were in the negative, and their treatment began to change with me, telling me that you are lying to us. Then several soldiers sat me down on the floor, on my toes, while I was kneeling. Then a soldier stood behind me, and a soldier to my left and right, and started banging my head with the fingers of their hands all together, like a head-banging system, one from the right, one from the left, and a fourth one in front of me, was sitting on a chair, listening to me talk about me and my wife, until their hands got tired while they were banging on my head. I was under the beating, in addition to a soldier who stood behind me and put the weight of his leg on my back and shoulders and was pressing to torture me more. And I did not endure this situation, and I started screaming. My voice became inaudible from the sea. They finished the beating and then took me back to the disco room, and about an hour later they took me there. After about an hour, they took me to the interrogation room again, with a different interrogator. The interrogation was at about midnight. In this session, they kept waiting for an hour or two in the chair, and I was tied up in the chair. the officer would come and ask me one question and then go away for about an hour and the same thing over and over again. He would come back and ask me one question and go away. He asked me what you were worth in the Yarmouk Stadium. And I told him that I was distributing internet to the people via SIM card because internet was scarce in the area. Another question he asked me was my relationship with Dr. Fulani al-Fulani, so-and-so, with whom I had contact and social visits. And in this session, he made me wait for after 48 hours. One of the soldiers woke me up and told me to get better today, and then returned me to Sdetiman prison. I stayed in Sdetiman from the moment I entered the prison until my transfer on about the 100th day, specifically on June 30th, 2025. At that time, I was deported to Ofer camp. On the 18th or 19th day until the 100th day, I was a shawish. And the shawish had special treatment, meaning a little bit better. As I spoke with them, that role meant that I spoke with them as an intermediary between them and the prisoners, because I spoke English. In Sdetiman, a dog called the dog unit with trained sniper dogs, and sometimes they suppressed all the prisoners inside the section without distinction, including the shawish. They suppressed us on the first day I was a shawish. And the way of beating was with sticks or police dogs. Many prisoners were injured and were bleeding. I had blood coming out of my leg from the beating, and I was beaten. These units were used to raid the wards every week, sometimes every 10 days. And sometimes they would randomly select 4 or 5 people. They chose randomly and oppressed them, especially without the rest of the prisoners, with very severe beatings, using dogs or other means. And even the other means were annoying and disgusting. One of the inhumane methods is that they force the young man to open his legs, and when they open his legs, a soldier grabs his testicles with his hands. Soldier would hold his testicles with his hands in a painful way, and the young man would scream of pain, and the sound of screaming was as if he was dying. This was very, very harmful to a frightening degree, and everyone was afraid, including me, because the choice was random, and we did not know who was next. And this was a psychologically harmful subject. Also, the way they woke us up by hitting sticks very hard on the walls of Zinco. The food was very, very scarce and uneatable. Every meal was a spoonful of tuna and jam, and this is the food, which is the filling with pieces of bread. The drinking, as for the drinking, we did not cut off the water. It's not clear in the text. The subject of bathing was once a week, with each prisoner for 4 minutes, during which he starts and bathes between taking off clothes, bathing, and putting on new clothes. All of this in 4 minutes. And whoever is delayed more than 4 minutes is subjected to punishment. After 100 days of detention, I was transferred from Sdetiman to Ofer camp. Ofer consists of concrete rooms, and there were constant searches inside the rooms. They are for them a search, but we call it repression because every search must include beatings. We are hit either on our legs or on our heads. And every time we enter the room, there must be blood from the beatings. In the eye, in the head, and of course, there is no treatment at all. Painkillers or anything else are not given. Sdetiman, the medical aspect was better than Ofer from the treatment point of view. I lived with the prisoner Mus'ab Haniya in Sdetiman from the beginning of the arrest. Mus'ab Haniya was a man about 35 years old, and his health was good, but he had an issue in Sdetiman. He goes to the bathroom suddenly to vomit continuously, and every half hour he goes to vomit and says, I have an issue with my stomach. I lived with him for about a month, and then he moved to a second section of prison, and I moved to Ofer. I stayed in Ofer for about 8 months. I did not meet Mus'ab until on January 1st, 2025, where Mus'ab and I met in one room in Ofer, in room 1. I entered the room and saw a young man on a mattress who could not get up. I did not recognize him. This young man informed me that he was Mus'ab Haniye. I did not recognize him because his shape changed and his body changed dramatically from the beginning of his arrest. And his weight became about 45 kilos, very thin, and his hair fell out. And Mus'ab was very tired, always sleeping on his back. And even in the issue 4 times a day, we were answering for him in the roll call. I was asking for a doctor. And after a long effort, they took him to the hospital. And when he was discharged to the hospital, they returned him to the same room in less than 24 hours at about 2 a.m. He was very tired. He had no mattress and no blankets because they withdrew them after he was transferred to the hospital. And when they brought him, I called them and asked for his mattress and blankets, and they told me, God, manage your situation. Give him from what you have. Of course, we did not have any extra blankets or mattresses, and we were in the winter season. They were in the winter season. 3 blankets for 1 prisoner is not enough. They forced us to open the windows and forbade us to close them. We felt like we were always sleeping on the street in the air and in the cold. And the more we closed the windows against their orders, the more they got tired of us. And in the end, they removed the windows completely, permanently. I lived with Mus'ab for about 5 days, as he was martyred on May 1, 2025, 5 days after I moved to the same, on January 1, 2025, 5 days after I moved to the same room. And what happened was that on 5/1/2025, on the morning issue, after the morning issue, I was required to go outside the room to distribute food to the other prisoners. Before I went to distribute the food, I looked at Mus'ab until I got to him. I found him with his eyes open and looking at the ceiling. He did not move, only his throat was moving. And I tried to talk to him. He did not answer me at all. Even his eyes did not blink for a long time. I and the others felt that he was struggling with death. Immediately, I went outside to distribute breakfast and reported to the officer about Mus'ab. When I reported to them, and when they saw him from the surveillance cameras and from the window of the room. They saw him and then acted urgently. Immediately, they told me to go back to the room and not to distribute food. And they asked me and the other youth in the room to transfer him to the isolation room in the department. And I picked him up and moved him. And on the way, I talked with him and said, "Hey, Mus'ab, watch." Then I put him in the solitary room, and the doctors came immediately. They brought medical equipment, resuscitation devices. All the time they were with him, and the doctor was coming and going. Ali asked me when was the last time I talked to him and what happened to him. And he was a doctor. I spoke to him in English, and he was wearing an army uniform. I told him that the last time I talked to him was at 10 o'clock at night before going to sleep. During these 5 days, he did not have vomiting, but what he suffered from the most was that he could not stand on his feet. And he needed somebody to help him, to carry him, to take him to the bathroom, even help him undress. Of course, when he returned from the hospital, I asked him, "What happened to you?" He told me the doctors told him that he had bone cancer. I personally don't know if he was suffering from anything before the arrest, but the symptoms he had from the beginning were vomiting. Of course, they didn't give him any medicine or keep him in the hospital, and even when I was talking to the officer at the station and telling him that the Mus'ab had bone cancer, the officer told me he was a liar and that this had nothing to do with it. Of course, Mus'ab died in their hands at the station while they were trying to revive him, and then they put him in his zipper bag and pulled him out of the station in front of our eyes.
We have about 7 minutes before we're going to take an afternoon break, and I'm going to invite questions from the audience.
What happened in this testimony?
the testimonies?
Yes.
This tribunal.
They're going to be included in the record of the tribunal.
My question is to Professor Hajjar. With respect to your typology of torture, I was a bit surprised that you mentioned that you think the majority of torture is either judicial torture or the one seeking to get actionable. Is it working? Or the one seeking actionable intelligence. Because if you think of the large numbers involved, the generalized inhumane conditions, the shackling for 100 days or months, the medical neglect, the diapers, the food starvation, the constant beatings, the amputation because of the shackling of the deaths, and we don't know the full picture yet. That seems to lead to the conclusion that, for example, Ari Nair had, which is this is sadistic torture rather than a torture seeking kind of utilitarian kind of torture.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that in some ways the two, it was pre-October 7th that there were more quote-unquote rational reasons, was the judicial and the action potential. But indeed, I think that what we've been hearing, the testimonies, what I've even said, like all of those forms of, if you wanted to work them into that typology, that would be penal torture, like just punishing people extrajudicially. And it was, in a sense, what was so, what's so intense about what's happened in prisons, where prisons have literally been extensions of the war, where it's like individuals are being attacked, but it's completely collective. I mean, it is the totality of anyone in custody who's being abused, but each person is being abused. Everybody has their own body, their own psyche, etc. And so I think that is it. And then also the paradox, which we've thought about a bit, is that on the one hand, there's this, clampdown of information that Ben Gvir, closes off any kind of contact. I mean, that's partially penalizing, no ICRC representatives, etc. But on the other hand, there is like an incredible, like the Israeli government or the IPS would bring in Israeli media in order, as if they were like taking journalists, in order to project out to the audience that wants to see Palestinians suffering. They want to see it. They want to see those, the kinds of things that everybody was reading in the testimonials, recording that kind of a thing and taking pictures of it. And so it is that sense of like both the secrecy and the kind of cruel, sadistic publicity. And the paradox, is that because, again, sort of the point that I had made was that torture, in principle at least, should be the easiest kind of gross crime to pursue because there's nothing subjective about custody. But the issue around this kind of question was even the now ex-head of Shin Bet, Ron Bar, was warning Ben Gvir and Netanyahu that this kind of treatment of Palestinians in custody, from the minute that they're swept up by soldiers in Gaza or in the West Bank, and what happens to them in prison, etc., coming out of prison 8 months later, down to the bare bones, etc. They said that kind of thing is going to make it difficult for some of our leaders to fly out of the country. So, I mean, he knew it. I mean, that's the thing. You don't say that for the people. You're not worried so much for the fighter bombers who are dropping bombs, but it is literally the people who've laid hands on Palestinians in custody that are potentially the easiest to get.
Thank you very much. My question is to Lisa too. Lisa, as you just stated, actually, torture must be one of the easiest ones, quote unquote, to pursue and prosecute. But what about the prosecutors? I mean, has there been even a single prosecutor who dared to investigate any one of these crimes? I mean, have you seen any motion on the part of the Israeli judiciary?
Other than that attempt to get the gang rapist. No, I'm talking about outside. I mean, and this is where I would say, like, one thing I always tell my students, universal jurisdiction, it's the best jurisdiction. We can, I mean, and I do believe that in the political circumstance, it's eminently important for the ICC or ICJ, which is not, not a criminal court, but it's for these things to sort of create a record or provide a certain kind of legitimation. But we are living in a period where there is such a fragmentation between people who are not just turning a blind eye on the genocide in Gaza and all of its elemental parts, but are facilitating it. And then like the other half of the world is like adamant, like I believe what I see, I know what I understand. And so the question of, the anger towards not only what's happening to Palestinians, but what other countries are doing to punish people who are critical of those actions. That's the kind of environment in principle where there can be potentially some kind of accountability. So for example, the Hind Rajab Foundation is like working with people who are, doing social media, gathering specific information about specific soldiers, specific units, specific actions that they did in order to like pass that information. Some soldier goes on vacation to Brazil, boom, the information gets to Brazil, prosecutors may go after. That's, I think, the most, that is a manner where there may possibly be some means of accountability because universal jurisdiction is the best jurisdiction.
So one more question.
Thank you. We know that the Arab rebellion, the Palestinian rebellion between 1936 and 1939, at the very end of it, everyone saw the Second World War around the corner. So the British called the RAF in from their nearest base, Amman, to bomb villages. Further, they carried out starvation in open-air prisons of rebellious people, in open-air prisons with no food, no water, and no shade. So my question is, did the Israelis ever use the British policy then as a precedent?
Yes. I mean, like the Israelis after 1948. I mean, they had during the pre-state, before Israel was established, and the British used the British emergency regulations against both Palestinians and Zionists, and the Zionists condemned them as outrageous. But then, as soon as Israel was established, they didn't pass their own. They just simply said, well, the British left these, what can we do? They're law enforced in the land. And so they kept those kind of things. But one can think about those types of policies. I mean, like the Negev, during the first Intifada, when the prison was established, when the rates of arrest were, for the first time really spiked, and where they built the prison out in the Negev. I mean, that was the whole point. It's like putting people in the desert, under the sun, etc. State Haman is exactly the same thing. So in a sense, you're seeing, certain kinds of repressive patterns that repeat themselves.
One last question.
Shout it out.
Well, you have a lot of people behind you, so why don't you take this?
Thank you. My question really is about who could be sued for this. Are the companies that give them the torture equipment could be sued? The governments that allow these equipment to be shipped, could they be sued? The ports that allow this shipment to go there, could this be sued? Who could be sued in terms of companies and people?
I don't think, that's a very good question. For example, in the U.S. war on terror, there were efforts, and in fact, a few of them many years after the fact were successful in suing contractor corporations, ones that ran the torture flights, etc. But in the case of Israel, there's not a lot of equipment for the torture specifically. I mean, there's absolutely, the other kinds of things, the sort of the purchasing and selling of spyware, etc. But I mean, if we're talking about the torture specifically, it's still kind of low tech.
Rubber bullets, dogs, other things.
Right. So that would be sort of, I mean, like, I always think of torture as like sort of the issue in custody and other kinds of actions like the armed conflict out in the streets kind of a thing. So that those are, I mean, the same thing can be said about, anybody, universal jurisdiction can go after any person or entity that has violated international law. Vis-a-vis torture specifically, I mean, like torture is different like it's a form of violence that is contingent on people being in custody. That's the difference between torture and other kinds of violence. They all occur on a continuum, but torture has its own very specific custodial dimension.